Hey everyone, thought I'd mix it up a little bit today and talk about Snap-on date codes and why they suck so much. You might have seen some of these online. I'm going to talk about how poor the design is, both in terms of the differences in these tables and also the codes themselves. So we'll get into it right after this. If you've seen any of my other videos, you know that I collect Craftsman tools, and I featured some of these at the bottom in my previous videos and didn't know what these markings were. And one of my subscribers, Google user GP, what's up dude, helped me along, helped me understand what these markings are, and commented on them, and has been really helpful. So did a little research, and the more I look into it, the more frustrated I am by these markings. So I have a few Craftsman that I want to talk about and a few Snap-ons. But before I get into that, let's talk for a minute about Daniel M. Lange. So Daniel apparently worked for Snap-on Tools in the late 20s, early 30s, probably right around when these symbols started, the date codes. And then in 1932, I guess he branched off and started A&E Manufacturing Company. Snap-on was then the first customer of A&E, and they started producing all these tools for Snap-on. Later on, A&E produced tools for other companies like Craftsman that you see here, as well as Armstrong, Klein Tools, and Williams. But one important thing to note is that Daniel Lange, through the years, created a few patents. They're noted here on the tools and used up until this day. So this one, 2500835, it's on the Craftsman tool, right? But this one is from 2007. So it wasn't too long ago that they're still using this. This one right here is from 2012. All right, not that long ago. This one is from 1998. You could tell at that time they weren't stamping the logos. They did this laser etching, which rubs right off over time. But even though they say 1987, that's when these two patents were created. And in those two patents, really got into the details of the construction of these offset ratcheting wrenches. You can find a lot more detail online. I just wanted to point out those couple things about the offset ratcheting box wrenches. Really cool stuff there. So here's my guess. I'm guessing Daniel Lange was working for Snap-on. He was an engineer there for sure. He was working there through this time, around the beginning of the date code in 1927. In 32, that's when he started A&E Manufacturing. So I'm guessing he had something to do with the start of this date code. So he has to have some responsibility for this. And then once he started A&E, Snap-on continued to use this system. They eventually used it for other companies. And that's, I think, where it started. So you can find plenty of videos around how to use this date code system. I'm sure you're here because you want to know why I think it sucks. Well, first of all, there's different types of tables. You'll see this one. If you do a quick search, you'll find this guy that only goes up to 1999. And you'll find this 2-pager that does the whole gamut, 1927 all the way through 2029. Same time frame as this one. The problem with these is that there's some inconsistencies. I'll point them out here on these two. Some of these problems I've identified when I was looking at update codes on these tools here. For example, this socket is from 1937. It has this code here, which, you look at the details, has a swoop at the top of the 7 and that little serif hanging off of the bottom. Look at the one on this 1937. It doesn't have those details. If you look closely, you'll see that in a lot of cases. Like 1939 has that little swoop on the round part. No swoop here. It's very straight. Very subtle, but definitely inconsistent. I think this one is more accurate based on the codes that I've seen on tools, but it only goes up to 1999. Another problem is that they're all low res. I mean, these are the best ones that I found, but I don't know. I'm tempted to create a high res version of it. I can't take it. Anyways, on to other problems. I'll quickly show you the symbol I'm talking about. So there's the 7, right? You can see a clear swoop at the top. Definitely closer to that one than the other one. So little things like that are pretty important to identify these, especially on the really older ones when they're worn off or smaller in some cases. This shiny beauty here has that little swoop next to the USA mark. That's from 1991. Let's see, way over here, right? Pretty clear. Not too old, but very beautiful tool. Very good shape. These tongue and groove pliers have a number 3 there. See it at the end of the patent number. It's from 1963. Where is it? Right there. Which, I don't know. It's a little close to the E. There's some differences there, but on a really small logo, right, if it was upside down, kind of looks like an E. Of course, it is a backwards E. But that's one problem with these symbols. Some of them are really close to each other and hard to tell apart. Now let's talk about the biggest problem, extensibility. Now, as a designer and a typography nerd, I'm very keen on these issues, right? You always have to design for extensibility, especially for something expected to last a long time. Now, I always imagine myself in a meeting with designers when I see stuff like this and how they came up with these systems, how they brainstormed. And of course, you know, in 1927, they probably still new. They probably thought, well, we only have to do it a few times, maybe into the next decade. But let's just use 7, 8, 9 for these ones. 1930 came around, 0. Then they thought, well, let's be creative, right? Let's use symbols. Did that for a few years and said, oh, forget that idea. Let's go back to numbers. So they have these really fancy, almost script-like numbers through the rest of the decade. 1940 came along, said, well, can't use a 0 again, so let's change it up and do this hatch, this mark across the 0. Different types of really strange 1, 2, 3. Very nice though, nice cool style there. 44 came along, and I'm learning that this is for World War II. They started making tools for the government, so they called them E for emergency. There's some questions about G standing for government, but not entirely clear on that one. And then went back to these kind of funky numbers through the rest of the decade. 1950 came up with another problem, right? And they might have thought about it ahead about these in the previous decade, just like they did for, you know, these other ones going through all 2029. But at this time, I don't know if they were thinking ahead so far, because you could tell they were starting to run out of ideas. Some of these started to look a little bit the same, just with subtle differences. And then once they got into the 60s, they said, we got to change it up quite a bit. So they got into this kind of a digital style, squared off numbers, a Z for 62, right? Very digital style numbers for this decade. And during the 70s, they said, screw it, let's just go backwards. Why not? Little problem with the 8, of course, because it looks the same both ways, so they removed the top and bottom. The 9 looks like an E, a lowercase e, really close to these but backwards. But you can see how it's a design challenge, and a really hard one too, right? I think they could have done some other things, but if they're sticking with the single number system, they got to take it as far as they can, right? So getting into the 80s, and you know other designers are in on it by this time. I'm thinking it's even probably like someone from marketing or something with not so creative ideas, at least visual design ideas. But they got into this funky numbering system. Look at that, 2 and 3. 5's pretty weird. 8 and 9, almost like an early video game style. It's an alternate for 6. It's either backwards or frontward. During the 90s, a little more free-flowing. The swoopy 0 and 1. Got a nice stylized 4. Again, a backwards 6. I don't know why they kept it backward when that symbol doesn't look like any of the previous 6s. I don't know, maybe to differentiate it from an upside down 9. Right. Most likely. Into the 2000s, they went almost back to the 60s style, kind of boxy, but angled. So 1, 2's getting a little weird. 7's really weird. I think I have one of those right here. 8 and backwards 9. I don't know why they do that. It's not like the others. I guess to differentiate it from an upside down 6 again, most likely. And into the 2010s, all very roundish, weird, weird base of the 1, the 2 and 3 and 4, very weird 5. Similar to the 2, but if you flip it upside down, it's different. Same with the 9 and 6. It's a backward 9, so they have see what the problem is. They have to accommodate these things, and so they just flip it upside down or flip it backwards to solve it, and it's a weird solution. But we're going to see this all into the next decade. So 2020 is when this video is created. These numbers aren't so bad. They're kind of similar to the 2000s, the angles and sharp lines. It's like a mixture of the 2000s and the 60s, right? Kind of straight and angled. It's a mixture of the two. Going all the way up again to the backward 9. Very strange. I mean, what are they going to do next? It's just it's an extensibility problem for sure. Kind of like what happened with the Y2K problem. If you're not familiar with the Y2K problem, look it up. It was a huge deal in the 90s. They called it the Y2K scare or the millennium bug. But basically, it started when financial institutions in the 60s created some computer programs, but didn't think that it was going to go into the year 2000. They didn't think it would last that long, so they only used 2 digits instead of 4 digits for the year. So as the year 2000 approached, it was a huge deal, right? Because nobody knew that when you go from 99 to 00, that the programs would know that it was talking about the year 2000 instead of 1900, right? So it was a multi-billion-dollar problem in the late 90s. A lot of consultants came in to fix all these problems or tried to. They spent a lot of money, and there was a lot of predictions about gloom and doom, and basically it was a small hiccup. But anyways, similar type of issue, just not thinking ahead, not thinking that this design is going to last that long. I see it's really similar to what SnapOn did with these codes. And if you want my solution, I say for something like this, just use 2 digits, right? You can use the same font throughout the entire century. If you look at that one from 1937, if that just said 37, you would know exactly when it's from, 1937. In 2037, you could still use 37, and it's going to look completely different because it's 100 years later. You're not going to have the Y2K problem, but just using the same style, very clear numbers, you wouldn't come across this problem at all. You'd be able to pick up a tool and know exactly what year it was from without having to pull out a chart or think about it or anything. It'd be very easy to fix that problem. So what did we learn? We learned not to use this one. It's not detailed enough. Crappy resolution. We learned if you're going to design something, think ahead, right? Think about extensibility. If you're interested in extreme extensibility, look up the 10,000 year clock project from the Lange Foundation. Super fascinating. Makes you change the way you think about design and extensibility. Super cool. Anyways, well, when I started looking at these codes, it just frustrated me as a designer. So I don't know if any of you feel frustrated by it, but let me know in the comments below. And if you like this video, give it a thumbs up, subscribe, click the bell icon, share it, all that good stuff. And until next time, see you later.